All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Rich Veit, and I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Monmouth University. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, the election we didn't expect. And the event is presented by Monmouth University's Polling Institute and the director of our Polling Institute, Patrick Murray. The Monmouth University Polling Institute was established in 2005 to be a leading center for the study of public opinion on critical national and state issues. The Polling Institute's mission is to foster greater public accountability by ensuring that the public's voice is heard in the policy discourse. And the Polling Institute's mission has three core components: monitor public opinion on current issues, collaborate with faculty and students to enhance research and training opportunities, and provide research that assists policymakers with planning and assessment. And it is consistently, the Polling Institute is consistently rated as one of the top polls in the nation for both accuracy and transparency. And the poll analysis website, 538, ranked Monmouth University's Polling Institute as the fifth best in the nation out of more than 500. And that is a figure of which we are justifiably proud. So we're also very proud of the work that the Polling Institute does and of its director, Patrick Murray, my friend and colleague, who is a nationally recognized expert in polling. So thank you so much for joining us this evening for the election we didn't expect. I'm going to hand it over to Patrick Murray, our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rich, for that nice introduction. Welcome to all of you out there. Obviously, we're less than a month away from Election Day now, and we still are very confused about what's going on. None less so than us pollsters and anyone basically who's running any of the campaigns right now. It is really it's been an unusual ride so far, and it will continue to be as we go through Election Day and the count beyond that. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to share some slides with you of some of our recent findings around this election and some of the major themes that are driving this election and why we don't know exactly what's going to happen right now, and certainly I don't think will even up to Election Day because of a real change in dynamics that we've seen in the way we think about politics in this country that has happened over the past, particularly over the past 10 years, but certainly over the past 25 to 30 as this shift has happened. So I'm going to share my screen and move into some of these presentations here. All right, so it's funny. I've been doing a lot of discussions, a lot of talks. All of them were planned, or I was invited to do that back in the summer. And in the summer, my working title was "The Election No One Wanted," because at that point we had a race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, a rematch that a majority of voters said that they would prefer not to see. They were absolutely unenthusiastic about that happening. Enthusiasm started to build a little bit as they got closer and people started to accept that as a reality. But then after that debate in June, we had a flurry of activity over a month that really changed this dynamic to the election that we didn't expect. Oops, and you see my screen. There we go. And so as we move on to figuring out, who's up, who's down, we have to start with some of the basics, which is what are the issues that people are concerned about? And those issues are really not framed in the same way as the media would have you think, because the media is asking, certainly when they call me, they ask about issues related to the way that we used to think about politics as being undecided voters. There's a whole block of them out there. There are issues that are important to a large swath of voters that they're deciding who will do a better job on. And that's not the way we think about issues anymore. Issues don't determine, which side of the aisle we belong to. It's become more which side of the aisle we are on determines which issues are important to us. So here's a poll that we did a couple of years ago, but in fact, the findings still hold, which is we presented a national sample of American voters with a whole host of issues. It said how important are they, and how do you think Biden's handling these issues? But the first column is the one that's really what I'm focusing on. How important are these issues? And you can see there's a whole host of issues that are important: inflation, crime, elections, jobs, immigration, all above 2/3, infrastructure and abortion and racial inequality, gun control, climate change, all at half or better. And when we go down to COVID and student loan debt, those were further down. And so when you look at it, you say, oh, Americans have a whole range of issues that they are really interested in. But it really depends on which Americans you talk to. So if you talk to Democrats, these are the issues that actually emerged as their top issues when we asked this question. So you see a whole range of issues there: inflation, elections, jobs, unemployment, but really strong on issues that seem to be somewhere towards the bottom half of the pack: abortion, racial inequality, gun control, and climate change. These are issues that are at the top of the pack, along with the economic issues, if you're a Democrat. If you're a Republican, however, there really is a different set of issues. In addition to inflation, which is the overriding issue, for you, it's crime and immigration. These are issues that Democrats don't rank at all as issues that they're talking about, but Republicans are. By the same token, Republicans aren't talking about or are expressing concern about the issues that Democrats are. And then if we talk to independents, true independents who don't lean either way, it really is just the economics. It's just inflation. They're not, crime and immigration are not at the top of their list. Abortion, gun control, climate change, not at the top of their list either. It really is just the economics. So when you are focusing on just what are the issues that America should be dealing with, not asking the question of who's got a better stance on those issues, you really are talking to different people have entirely different worldviews around what government should be tackling. When we look at the economy, however, that's the issue that really drives everybody. So no matter what your partisan stripe, everybody's concerned about the economy. And that is really what was driving this race up until the change. And it's still a major factor in this race, but it's a factor that affects people in different ways. So a question that we've asked is, what's your current financial situation? Are you struggling? Are you stable? Or are things getting better for you? And we've asked this question going back to the Obama administration. And if you look on the left side of the screen there, where we see the 51% and then the 29% and the 20%, these numbers from the last month of the Obama administration into the first year of the Trump administration don't change all that much. However, what we did see change is that we had a significant number of Democrats who moved from stable to struggling, and a significant number of Republicans who moved from struggling to stable as we went from the Democratic administration to the Republican administration. Now, did something specific happen to them over the course of a year that caused Republicans to do a lot better and Democrats to do a lot worse? No, not really. We can't point to anything that would have affected people of different partisan ideologies differently. All we can say is that this question, which used to be a question that we would ask that would really just measure what's going on in your home, is now also a measurement of where you see yourself in the world politically. Now, having said that, and saying that this has been something that's really changed our minds about, and from the polling perspective, about what we can truly measure, that is not filtered through a partisan lens anymore, we still do see some shifts when something huge happens. And so if we go to the middle of this graph around June 2022, You can see there's a big jump in struggling and a little drop in people who said they're doing stable, another drop in people who said that they were improving. This is when inflation just went through the roof. And so we even had some Democrats who were shifting on this issue as well as independents, which moved that number. And as you can see, our most recent poll from June, the number who say they're struggling, the number who said they're stable is about the same, whereas only 9% said that they're improving. And that is a real problem for Joe Biden, is that people were saying that this has really changed. The inflation rate has really changed things. When we were going through COVID, it didn't change things all that much. Even though the economy was having bumps, it wasn't affecting us. This is what really affects us. And so if we look to the right on our bar chart there, a question that we've asked a number of times when we've had record growth and the Dow Jones was doing well, is about whether you're benefiting from this economy. Now, obviously, we skipped a few years during the pandemic and during that high inflation rate, but we've jumped back into asking this question again at the beginning of this year. And as you can see that in the Obama and Trump years, we're talking about, between 40 and 50% who said that they were benefiting from the economy. But in the Biden years, this past year, it's only been a third, with over 4 in 10 saying that they have not benefited at all from this growing economy. And that was the real kicker for Joe Biden, is that the Biden campaign and the Biden administration were sending out messages that were saying, hey, look at all these great things that are happening in the economy. We rescued the economy. And people are saying, I am paying more for my groceries than I did 3 years ago. That's all that matters to me. And then even when the inflation rate started to go down, the Biden campaign kept saying, okay, now the inflation rate's going down, so you're fine. And people said, no, I'm not fine, because I am still paying a lot more for my groceries and my other bills than I was 3 years ago. And that didn't seem to get through to the Biden administration, that you can't talk about to people that way. You're basically telling them how they feel is not right, that they're incorrect in having those feelings. And of course, once you do that with voters, you've lost them, which is why if Biden had stayed in this race, I think at this point in time, we'd see a pretty clear lead for Donald Trump. But what happened here is that if Biden and folks had looked at history, it would have told them that they couldn't run on that kind of message. Because if you go back to the Consumer Confidence Index, which we've had around since the 1960s, it has shown us that every time that there's been an inflationary spike, it's taken, and then that spike died down, it's taken anywhere from 6 to 12 months for the public to regain their confidence in the economy, to feel okay with where things are going. It's because they got to get used to the higher prices. They got to wait for their wages to start to catch up with them. And then it's kind of all settled down. What happened is that this inflationary spike didn't go down until a little less than a year ago. And it's going to take at least until December or January for people to kind of get accustomed to that. So, and that's after the election. So that's why the Biden campaign I was scratching my head, because we were doing polls on the economy that was saying that people don't like to be talked at and talked down to and told that their feelings are wrong, when they know for a fact that they're paying more, regardless of what else is going on in the economy. And this question that we ask about, hey, the economy's growing, how are you doing with that? And then people saying, I'm not getting my fair share of it. That's a key metric that seemed to be ignored. But when we get into this campaign with Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, we're seeing a different range of issues. Certainly the economy and inflation are number one. And this chart that I'm showing right here is not a polling chart. It is how often each candidate talked about these issues in the debate that they had last month. And you can see that there was a lot of talk, particularly on the Trump side, about the economy and inflation, because it still is a negative for that current administration, and by extension for Democrats, and certainly for the Vice President, Kamala Harris. But look at some other things that they talked about. Immigration. Donald Trump talked about that a lot more. abortion. Now, both of them talked about this, but this was an interesting thing when you go back and look at that debate. Donald Trump, in this case, actually took kind of the bait. Certainly Kamala Harris wanted to talk about this, but Donald Trump talked about this a lot on the defensive. Taxes, interesting. Kamala Harris talked about this a lot more, but mainly because she had two specific proposals that she was putting forward for tax credits. One was a child tax credit. The other one was a first-time homebuyer credit. So she wanted to get those ideas out there. And Donald Trump is not talking about those issues because they're just not a factor in his cohort, in his party right now, the group of voters that he needs to get out. But crime, for example, is. That's an issue that he certainly wants to talk about. So he's talked about that a lot more than Kamala Harris did. When we ask about the qualities of the two candidates and the issues and where they stand and who do you trust on those issues, you can see that in most of these metrics, there's a small, but not and by any stretch, a significant lead for Kamala Harris on the candidate qualities, whether they have the capability of doing the job, whether they're a strong leader. And then when we get to some, like, do they have a good idea about what they're going to do to help American families? Trump has a slight advantage there, understands the day-to-day concerns of people like you. Harris has a slight advantage there. But when we get to two issues in particular, immigration and abortion, there's a much bigger advantage. Donald Trump has a big advantage on immigration. Kamala Harris has a big advantage on abortion. And if we dig further into these numbers, and if we look just at men, Donald Trump has an astronomical advantage on immigration. And if we look just at women, Kamala Harris has an astronomical advantage on abortion. And is that because he's winning the debate on immigration and she's winning the debate on abortion among people who are up in the air about who has the better policies? No, it's because those issues are the issues that motivate voters who are already inclined to support those two candidates. They're kind of like, I kind of compare them to a field on flags on a smoky battlefield. So if you're in a battle and in the old days and there's a lot of smoke, and what you look for if you got lost on the battlefield is your side's standard. The flag that indicated which side was your side versus which side was their side. So you know which side to run to. And this is what I think about when I think of immigration and abortion, is that they're flags on the battlefield. So if you see, you're lost in the battlefield, you're not sure where your people are, and you see a flag on one side that says immigration and a flag on abortion on the other side, you know which side to go to. You know which people, because if it's abortion and you're on the left, you know that those are your people there. It's not going to be people on the right talking about this issue because it's not motivating them in this election. Same thing if you see the flag of the issue of immigration on the other side. If you're on the right, that's where you need to go to be with your people, because the other side isn't talking about immigration. This is the issue that gins people up on the right. And that's because our politics have really, changed a lot. Let me talk about that in the context of where we are in this presidential race. So, as I mentioned, the race really changed significantly when the Democrats changed their candidate. So as I mentioned, the enthusiasm wasn't very high for this election at all, but it started creeping up through the year. So by June, it was at 48% overall, with Republicans significantly more enthusiastic than Democrats. 71% for the Republicans, 46% for the Democrats, and only 34% for independents at that point. And it's basically, people are coming to terms with, okay, this is the election that we got to deal with, so I got to at least generate some enthusiasm. On the Republican side, that wasn't necessary because most Republicans got the candidate that they wanted. Now, when the candidate flipped, we saw almost a 40-point rise in Democratic enthusiasm to 85%. And it's now outpacing Republican enthusiasm by about 10 points. Even independent enthusiasm jumped because they had a fresh face to look at. They had somebody new, somebody different than what they're expecting. So we even saw a significant increase among independents on that measure. But as you see, when that jump happened in August, but then it stayed stable. So everything that we saw in terms of movement in this election happened in that one period for that one moment when they changed candidates. But other things that happened, assassination attempts, debate performances, all those things really didn't move the needle. So what we went was from an election that was really Trump's to lose to an election that was pretty much a dead even heat. And as we see here, this is a recent. I took this a couple of days ago, the screenshot, but it hasn't changed all that much. Harris has a lead in the polls of on the national level of about 2 points, and it's about 1 point lead in the seven states that we consider the swing states for either Harris or Trump. If you look at those polls, neither one of them is up by more than a point or so in any of those states. What that says to us, and this has been pretty stable since August. What that says to us is that we are an evenly divided country, that there isn't much that that you can move people one way or the other. So what is driving this election? Which candidate will it be? Well, it depends on who shows up. And voter turnout is really going to be a critical factor here. So maybe about 2/3 of voters will show up. So that means that difference of 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 40,000, that's it in one particular state could change the election because of the Electoral College. So let me take a lesson from 2021 and how we learned some things about what this electorate looks like. Here at Monmouth, we did polls in 2 races in 2021 that had gubernatorial elections, Virginia and New Jersey. In Virginia, the turnout was typical. What we found when we looked at our polling numbers, that the polls that we got with all registered voters, the polls that we got with who we thought were likely voters, actually matched what happened in the actual outcome. So it was about a 3-point win for the Republican, and that's what our poll showed. And that's because when we went back and looked at our samples, we found that the people who actually voted looked like all registered voters in what they wanted to happen and who they were intending to vote for. That was not the story in New Jersey. The story in New Jersey was among all registered voters, the Democrat had a 9-point lead, and our likely voter models showed something close to that. But then when we actually went back after the election and looked at who we sampled in our polls and who actually voted and who didn't, we saw that our likely voter model was wrong. Our underlying sample was right. But if we had accurately predicted who was going to go out to vote, we would have had the margin correct, which was about a 3-point win for the Democrat in that race. But so why didn't we know who was going to go out to vote in New Jersey when we knew that in Virginia? Well, as I said, in Virginia, it was a typical turnout. In Virginia, the people who turned out were broadly representative of all registered voters. In New Jersey, it wasn't. There was a skew. And there are 3 areas in particular that I point out. The area on the top right, which are the urban areas of the state, there was a big lack of enthusiasm among Democratic urban voters, and the vote totals were actually down. Not just the margins for the Democrat, Phil Murphy, but the actual number of votes were down in 2021 versus what he got in his 2017 run when he ran the first time. The second area is in the middle of the state here of New Jersey, which is formerly Republican suburbs turned solidly Democrat. This was a reaction to Donald Trump, and it was a reaction that we weren't sure exactly what was going to happen here. We knew that there was a reaction in the suburbs, particularly among college-educated women, against Donald Trump, but we weren't sure whether that was going to hold for elections that didn't involve Donald Trump, and particularly elections that were at the state level rather than the federal level. And we're finding that coalition, that shift that happened, these are moderate, they used to be moderate Republicans, fiscally conservative, wanted low taxes, but also wanted, were somewhat more moderate in their views on things like abortion and gay marriage. And, this idea that, you don't want to demonize anybody. And that kind of turned them against Donald Trump. So they remain solidly Democratic. In fact, this is the area that Phil Murphy actually did better on in 21 than he did in 2017, while he was doing worse everywhere else in the state. And finally, and this was the most interesting thing in, I think, in our findings in New Jersey, was that our statewide elections, which happen in odd years, which means there's nothing federal on the ballot, always drew out a certain type of voter who was concerned with state issues. If you're only concerned with federal issues, you tended not to come out in these elections. You only voted in congressional elections, Senate elections, presidential elections. You didn't vote in these types of elections. So what we found, though, is that these voters came out in Republican working class areas. These voters came out. These are the kind of the culture war voters. And what's happening here is that people are now seeing every election as a reflection on this kind of national divide that we have. And that's what's bringing out this type of voter. And so even in an election where some of those issues weren't even talked about and part of the campaign, they were talked about on social media, which is where folks are getting their information from. Local newspapers, local news sources don't have the same kind of impact that they used to. I mean, you used to you turn to your local or state newspaper to find out what was going on in the state. People don't do that anymore. They get their information from these larger national sources that are curated to match their point of view. And this is happening on both sides of the aisle right now. And so basically what they're saying is that every election is important on these national issues. And that gets them out to vote. So that's what we're looking at in 2021. And we're going to look at that again in 2024. Which leaves us a map where, in particular, this type of voter, both types of voters exist. Both those suburban voters who flipped from Republican to Democrat, and those working class voters who become very much entrenched in the culture wars, exist in very similar numbers. And so that's why we have these states in the Midwest and these Sunbelt states in particular that are up for grabs, these tan states that you see on your map. Because we've become so entrenched in our partisan identity, that our partisan identity now tells us which issues are important, which way to go. And basically it's more about our culture and our values than it is a rational calculation about what issues are important this year and who has the better stance on those issues. So what does that look like on the national level? For example, we had on our last national poll among all registered voters, we had Harris with 48% and Trump with 44%. And if you look at those bottom two numbers, that's where these things are important. People who said they're going to vote for another candidate or no candidate choice added up to about 9%. When we move into what we consider more likely voters who are extremely motivated to go out and vote, that number falls to 3%, 2% for other and 1% for no undecided. There are no such things as true undecideds anymore. They just, as I keep hammering away at this, is that they just really don't exist. And it is because you lean one way or the other. Even if you haven't picked your candidate, at the end of the day, if you are aligned with a certain set of values, it's going to push you over one side or the other. As I mentioned, those voters, those suburban voters, were voters who like to sit on the fence and pick and choose where they went depending on what election they were looking at. And what's happened in the last 10 years is that you're not allowed to sit on the fence anymore. You're not allowed to pick and choose. This issue I'm going to be this way, this issue I'm going to be that way. Is that you have to abide by a certain kind of cohesive orthodoxy and be on one side or the other. There's no room in the middle anymore. And so what happens is we don't have undecided voters anymore. What we're looking at on a national level is that those extremely motivated voters, 3-point lead for Kamala Harris is to offer a 4-point lead among all voters. There's different models that put it different ways, but that's the national picture. If we look at a particularly important state, many people think that Pennsylvania is going to be the tipping point state. In our poll from a couple of weeks ago, we find that Harris is up by 2 points among all registered voters, among 4 points among extremely motivated voters. But then if we go back and say, if this election looks like the 2020 electorate, she's actually behind by a point, which means we really don't know which of these voters are going to show up because of that thing that's been happening with the voter turnout. And we have to move and say, even a 3-point lead or a 4-point lead is no longer a lead because of that unpredictability of that 2/3 of the electorate are going to show up and 1/3 is not going to show up. And it only takes a difference of 50,000 of those voters or less to be skewed from one way side or the other to change this from a 3-point race for one candidate to a 1-point race for the other candidate in those key states. All right, let me stop sharing my screen now. And kind of that gives you an overview of where we stand. And I'm going to go to questions. So I should say, for the questions, we're using the Q&A function there. And so if you have a question, drop it in the Q&A and we'll try to get them as many as we can. So the first question that I'll go to is, I was recently reading that in the 2022 midterms, the polls were skewed Republican because of money spent by the RNC on 4 to 5 conservative polls popping up to try and drive the message that Republicans were winning so that Democrats would be less likely to have enthusiasm and vote. This came as a surprise on midterm night in 2022 when the Democrats held the House and picked up congressional seats, except for in New York, and Florida too. Are these swing state conservative polls that only operate during specific elections? Is this a real phenomenon? All right, so let me jump into them. So this was the idea that there was this red wave predicted, and it wasn't just these polls, although there are a few polls out there. And then this is the problem that we have right now, is that polling has become very cheap to do if you want to do a bad poll. So you can get it out there. And the question is, who will pick it up? I think some of the polling aggregators, the one that I use the most is Real Clear Politics, because they don't try to forecast an election. They just simply try to say, here are the best polls that we can find that meet our minimal standards of validity. And here's the average of them. You do with the average what you want. And that, I think, is a better way to look at it. But having said that, yes, there are enough polls out there that suggested that there would be this red wave. And there was also the idea that, hey, it's a midterm of a Democratic president, there should be a Republican pickup. And in fact, what we saw was, other than in New York and in Florida, there were a lot of places where Democrats picked up seats and probably could have picked up a few more. I'm thinking of the Wisconsin Senate seat that was up for grabs there that ended up coming down to the wire that the Democrats didn't put any money in. Their own internal polling was telling them that, we might be able to hold on to this or hold on to that. But they actually were able to could have actually done even better. And that's why I keep saying we don't know what's going to happen in this particular election. By the way, we did polls in 2 states in 2022, in Georgia and Pennsylvania in particular, on the governor and Senate races in those 2 states. Our margins were almost on the money, particularly when we looked at our extremely motivated voters. That described the story of those elections. So we weren't caught up in that red wave phenomenon. We saw pretty much what was happening in those 2 states. But that's what makes us, unsure about which way this is going to go, because a slight difference in turnout can change this election. That's why I say if it looks like the 2020 election, Donald Trump will do better. If it looks like the 2022 election, in terms of these slight moves in turnout, then Kamala Harris will do a lot better than the polls are saying right now. And that's why I say anybody who goes into this election looking at the polling where it is right now and thinks that they know who's going to win this election, shouldn't. I mean, you should go into this with the expectation that it could go either way, because that's what the polling is telling us. All right, next question. Have you been able to do any measurement of the impact of media bias extensively for Democrats and against Republicans? Trump. So the media bias question is interesting. And here's what we've done a lot of polling in the past on media bias. And what we're finding is that people will believe that the media that they don't pay attention to is biased, and the media that they do pay attention to is not biased. And so that's what we have a problem right now, in that we're dealing with 2 different worlds. Is that there's no longer the Walter Cronkites and the big 3 broadcast networks that we implicitly put trust on that they're going to call it down the middle. Is that we very easily can find sources of information that reinforce our particular point of view. And in doing so, they suggest that the other point of view and the media sources that are coming from those other point of view are illegitimate. And that kind of just is a cycle that reinforces itself. I'm not sure how we get out of that cycle, because it's bad for the country that we don't have this kind of arbiter. The word media means to mediate, and to mediate between two sides, and it doesn't do that anymore. It is a media where we just don't have a level of trust across the board, and that's been a problem. So how does it affect the polls? Well, it just simply affects the polls in the sense that it just simply affects our idea that we're in this culture war, and you have to take sides, and your side is talking about these issues, and you're going to be reinforced about those issues, and those issues are right. And the other side is putting out misinformation, and unfortunately, that's where we are. All right. How did we select the people we poll? Do we poll the same people? um, so, uh, so there's a number of different ways that you can do an accurate poll. When we do an election poll, we start with the voter list because that tells us who the voters are. So whether it's national or whether it's in Pennsylvania, whether it's in a congressional district, wherever we poll, we start with the voter list. Those are the eligible voters. And on those voter lists, we have contact information, telephone number, usually sometimes an email address, but we usually use telephone numbers. Sometimes, in most of the cases, they're cell phone numbers. Sometimes they're landline numbers. And what we do is we select a random sample from that, making sure that the voters that we select are the right proportion of Democratic men and Democratic women and Republican men and Republican women and independent men and independent women, and across racial divides, across educational levels, and also particularly across geography, which we found in the past has been a very significant part of this. If you're a Democrat who lives in a blue area versus in a red area, and a Republican and vice versa, you have different likelihoods of showing up, and therefore we need to make sure that we have the right proportions of those in our polls. So we generally don't poll the same people over and over again. We do have a panel structure in our national policy polling, where we do include some people that we interview over time. Amongst the new respondents that we poll in those races, or excuse me, in those policy issues for those national polls. In election polls, though, almost always we're doing a fresh poll. Now, there are good pollsters out there who use panels, and panels are where you go back to the same people again. In those cases, those panels have been recruited using telephone and mail methods, so that the panel that they recruit starts out as a random probability panel, like the ones that we use for our polls here at Monmouth. And then they agree to be part of this panel where they'll be re-interviewed time and time again. Those are acceptable. You have to know who does them. There's CNN and SSRS do them. I think Ipsos is doing them with ABC News right now. Those are good. But then there's a lot of polls out there that just hire the panels that can use bots and so forth. You Amazon Turk, and they're not really pollsters. These are kind of going back to that question that we had a little while ago about the 2022 polls, is that this is a way that some folks try to hobble the polling average, is by just spend a few $100s, get a poll. It's done largely by bots, and you can put the numbers out there and claim that it's representative when it really isn't. How do betting sites factor into my thought process or methodology? They don't. I ignore them. I ignore them. I ignore the aggregators who have prediction models that say, Donald Trump has a 72% chance of winning this, or Kamala Harris has a 58% chance of winning this. That's not why I do this. That is not why I got into polling. I got into polling because I wanted to understand what makes our government tick. And this may sound soppy and highfalutin, as it were, but when I got into polling as a graduate student in political science, it was because I was really fascinated with this experiment that our founders created. This government that it only works by consent of the will of the people, and that our firewall against something happening is just simply that people have enough faith that government's going to work that they won't revolt against it. If you look at why our Constitution came about, it came about because there was incredible unrest in the country after we won the Revolutionary War, and they wanted to find a system that would give people a say, but still, tamp down the unrest, and that required people at least saying, "I'm not happy with government, but at least government basically works, and I'm just not happy with it right now. Too many taxes, too many this, too many whatever, but things are stable, so they're fine." So anyway, I got into polling because I wanted to understand what made people tick, that kept that going. And that's come to the forefront over the past 10 years. And I've done a lot of work in political psychology. I've worked with a psychologist, in fact, on some of the work that we've done. Um, and when I do election polling, it's because I want to tell a story that's tied to the stability of our system. I don't want to predict who's going to win. That's not why I got into this. I want to be accurate in terms of telling a story about what could potentially happen and where we stand right now, which is what polling does. But the prediction markets and the aggregators who do forecast models, they have no. I don't look at them at all. They have no bearing at all in what I do. I'm trying to tell a story about the here and now. And I got to say, one of the things that is interesting about polling is that we hold election polling to a higher standard than we hold any other type of polling that we do because our expectations are different. A lot rides on it. The problem is election polling inherently has more error in it than standard polling does. Because when I do standard polling on a policy issue, I know who my population is. My population are all Americans. I do a poll of all Americans. I get 58% who agree with policy X. And I find out that the real number is 62% agree with policy X. And people say, oh, you're off by 4 points. But hey, at 6 and 10, that's close enough for us understanding where the American public stands on policy X. But let's take an election poll where not only do I have to pull a sample of current voters, but I have to then tell you, or is supposed to tell you as a pollster, who's likely to show up. There's nothing in polling sampling that tells us what a future population is going to look like. We have to take a guess at that. We use past voting behavior, we use questions about their motivation, their enthusiasm, to try to figure that out. But it's just a guess. And sometimes that guess is wrong because if it's based on history, and as I pointed out in 2021, we had this really atypical turnout in New Jersey that history didn't tell us what's going to happen and other metrics didn't tell us what was going to happen. So we're introducing even more error. But if we say candidate X is ahead by 2 points and candidate Y wins by 2 points and we're off by 4 points, so that 4-point margin, which didn't matter to you when we were doing policy polling, is an absolute failure on the part of polling in this highly error-prone election polling situation. So we set our expectations in the wrong area when we talk about election polling. If polling is off by 10 points, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 points consistently on an election, then it's a problem. But if it's off by up to even 4 or 5 points, the problem is our elections are so close that if we were off by 5 points, we said somebody was going to win by 5 points and they won by 10, you'd probably ignore it. You wouldn't remember it. But again, if we say somebody's ahead by 2 points and the other person wins by 2 points, you're going to remember that, even though the error is exactly the same. So that's why I try to back off of these likely voter models and present a range of possibilities that could happen so that you kind of try to prepare people and basically tell them why that range could happen, the different types of turnout. So you're better prepared for those eventualities. How do I decide how to ask the questions? That's it. That's really kind of what I'm known for, is the questions that we ask on policy issues. And I really have a kind of a unique approach, I think, to this. It doesn't work as well today as it did when I got into polling 30 years ago. Because people don't talk about politics as openly and frankly as they used to. You got to be careful about who you're talking about it with. But I used to go into diners and sit and eavesdrop on conversations. Because not only did I want to know what issues people were talking about, but I wanted to know the vernacular, the words that they were using to describe them. Because I found sometimes pollsters, political operatives, and academics will talk about issues in ways that make sense to them, but they're using a language that people don't use when they talk about these same issues. Sometimes they're using dichotomies. Do you approve or disapprove of this? And where people don't think in terms of approve or disapprove on a particular issue. They might think, I can live with this. And I want to ask questions in the way that they're talking about that. So how I ask the questions, has a lot to do with trying to get an ear for how people even talk about things. When we started doing national polling here at Monmouth in 2015, one of the first things I did, knowing that we were doing national polling, we are going to poll the presidential primaries, is I went up to New Hampshire and I went out to Iowa and talked to voters in restaurants and in backyards there to kind of get a sense of, okay, what are you talking about? How are you talking about these issues? What are the things that are important to you? Because that's what I want to ask about, not the things that the media tells us are supposed to be important. That's why I get on the media when they start talking about this issue or that issue, or the candidate's not talking about that issue. So I said, well, the voters don't care about that issue. You care about that issue, and you want the candidates to talk about that issue. But I'm talking to voters, and they're telling me that these are the issues that they want to talk about. And in fact, these are the issues they want you to cover, and you're not covering them all that well either. So that's one of the things that we do when we ask questions. Let me see what else we got here. What percentage of people you poll are Democrat and Republican? Well, again, the percentage, and by the way, you can find this on all our polling. Depends on the state, depends on the geography. But as I said, when we do election polls, we pull from the voter sample. If the state has a party registration, then our voter sample matches that party registration. If it's 40% Republican and 30% Democrat, then our sample is 40% Republican and 30% Democrat. That it absolutely will match that. Now, having said that, there are some states that don't have party registration, but what we can figure out from them is who votes in which party's primaries. And so we can use that as a proxy for their voter registration, their partisanship. But the other thing is when we ask people how they think of themselves politically, sometimes they don't only think of themselves in the way that they're registered. In some cases, it's because their thinking has shifted. We've seen that in Pennsylvania a lot. So we see a number of registered Democrats who call themselves Republicans because that has shifted in Pennsylvania. But here in New Jersey, for example, we see a number of people who are registered as Republicans and Democrats who call themselves independents because we kind of have this independent mentality. We have generally have a higher number of independents in New Jersey than say Pennsylvania does because we don't have competitive primaries. So there's no reason for people to declare a party and come out and vote. So you'll see that. But what's interesting is that when we have independents, people say they're independent, we actually follow up and say, well, which party do you lean to? And it almost always snaps back to either Republican or Democrat in the way that we thought that they would be based on their party registration and their other answers in the survey. So I'm asked another question about a model. This is Alan Lichtman's model, 13 Keys to the White House. And I think I kind of answered that question when in prediction markets. Here's the problem with these economic models. So, he's Alan Lichtman and others. He's got 13 different pieces of information that he looks at. And he can claim that they correctly predicted every past election, or they correctly predicted 10 of the past 11 elections, or whatever they want to claim that they do. Here's the problem. And everybody should kind of understand this from, the criticism the polling gets. If you have a small polling sample, you're more prone to error than if you have a big polling sample. We know that. So what are they doing, these economic modelers? They're looking at most 20 past elections. And in most cases, they're only looking at 10 or 12 past elections, presidential elections, because they only happen once every 4 years. And what you can do is you can create a model that puts in different pieces of information that predicts those past elections accurately after the fact. And then you can say, well, I predicted all these elections after the fact. Then this model with all this information will predict the next one. But you only have 10 or 12 cases. That's a huge room for error, because what if the next election has something different that really impacts it that wasn't in your model? And your model's not going to work anymore. And I remember doing this when I first got into, when I was a graduate student, first got into polling, and I was working at a poll, and I looked at all our polling data, said, I wonder if I can come up with a regression model that predicts elections. And I did. I came up with one that predicted all the past elections. We had over 20 years worth of election polls in the database of the place that I was at. I was at the Eagleton poll at Rutgers University at the time. And I created a model that worked. And so we just held it in our pocket. And then we had the next election coming up. We took the next election. We ran the same model that worked in every past election on this new election after it happened. And it was wrong. It's because something different was going on in the election. We didn't have enough cases. Now, if you want to do it for House elections, there's tens of thousands of House elections going since the 1950s. There's over 1,000 Senate elections that have happened, and you probably can get enough information from those to create models. Presidential elections, good luck to you in doing that. But again, that's a prediction model, and that's not my job. My job is to tell a story about why things are happening. Give me the context of why things are happening and why things could go in either direction. What is important to the American people? That's my job, is to tell a story about the here and now, and not to predict or help you with your betting markets. I'll leave that to other folks. So I'm asked about, other pollsters, Trafalgar Group. There's others out there. There are some pollsters out there that have partisan leanings. There's some pollsters out there that don't have partisan leanings that we see have strange polling results early in the middle of the election season or in the fall, and then they suddenly snap to a different model that looks like all the other polls right before the election. So their final election polls are right, and others generate a lot of interest. And I won't mention any of these names. They generate a lot of interest because they are different. But then suddenly they look like all the other polls when we get to the poll that quote unquote counts for your accuracy. Having said that, though, I will say this: we're seeing a lot of good pollsters with odd polls out there. We haven't had an odd, quote unquote, odd poll yet at Monmouth, but even the New York Times Siena poll, which is actually one of the best polls out there, just put out a couple polls that run counter to what you thought. There was a close election nationally, but Kamala Harris was doing much better in Pennsylvania when you think it would be the opposite. We are seeing one phenomenon that is very interesting in Monmouth polls, which actually supports that finding from Siena and New York Times, and they are actually looking at the same thing in some of their other polls, which is in competitive areas, purple areas as they were, and red areas, Republican areas, the numbers are looking competitive, or at least typical, for the Democrat and the Republican, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It's in blue areas, and that includes blue states, where it looks like Kamala Harris is trailing what a Democrat typically does. So what that's telling us, even though we haven't polled in New Jersey and nobody's polled New Jersey, it's saying that, well, maybe we're going to see a Democratic margin that's closer to 10 points than 20 points in New Jersey. And not going to change the electoral outcome for New Jersey. It's still going to be a Democratic win, but maybe not by as much. Certainly, we're seeing that in polls coming out of California and New York. Where that does impact us, and what we're seeing that as an important factor, is, say, in Pennsylvania. And we actually did that. If you look at our polling site, which is www.monmouth.edu/polling, and you go to there and you'll see all our polls are up there. Our Pennsylvania poll, we found that Kamala Harris was very competitive in the competitive areas. She was behind, but not behind by any more than Joe Biden was 4 years ago in the red areas of the state. But she wasn't doing as well as Joe Biden did 4 years ago in the Philadelphia area and its suburbs. She was running about 9 points behind Joe Biden in those areas. So while she was clearly ahead in those areas, she had over 50%. It wasn't the over 60% that Joe Biden was getting when he ran in 4 years ago from those 5 counties in the Philadelphia metro area. So that's one of the phenomenons that we're seeing in the poll. So I kind of took that question and then asked me to go after other polls and kind of try to point out some factors that we are seeing that are causing polls to be different than what we expect. Okay, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions before I have to wrap this up. So how do the Institute's funding impact your polling? Do you have the funds that you need to do the level of polling? As you know, every college and university is going through a tough time right now. Enrollment is down, and private institutions, in large part, it's down because of, I don't know whether you heard about the FAFSA, the financial aid form, the federal financial aid form, which was a debacle. I think it caused a lot of people, a lot of students to, when they weren't getting financial aid, offers in time to decide either to sit out this year or to go to a state school, which means everybody's funding's down. So we don't have the funding that we had uh, back in the 2016 or 2020 campaigns for this one. So we've had it curtail. So what we did is we were picking and choosing key areas where we think that we can tell a story. So we're focusing on national, we're focusing on Pennsylvania. We have one congressional district in our backyard that we're going to be focusing on as well. And using those to try to tell this larger story that we can. Let me see. I think there's one more question that I can take before I have to wrap this up. How do you think that these large national polls adapt or reflect to early voting data that is being provided from certain battleground states? We don't have enough yet. It's a little too soon. So all we know is that the number of people who voted, we don't know who they voted for, obviously, until the votes are counted. But we do know in a state that is party registration, whether more ballots are coming back from Democrats or Republicans. It's too soon, but some polls will make some adjustments. What we found in 2022 in particular, and 2020 was an odd year, obviously, because of the pandemic. Some states did almost all vote by mail, so it was almost all early polling. But when in a more normal year, which was 2 years ago when we did the midterms in Georgia and Pennsylvania, what we found is that we do ask a question about what mode do you plan on voting in, whether it's an early vote in person, or whether it's by mail or an absentee ballot, or to show up on election day and vote. And we found that our estimates for those were fairly accurate. And indeed, we were most accurate on people who said that they would or had already voted early, the early voters. And so we're going to look at that very carefully, because that is one part of our poll that we're pretty confident in. And we're going to see if that meets, where does that fit with our expectations about how the two candidates should be doing in early polling in particular states, or excuse me, early voting in particular states, because that'll help us tell a story there before we get to the final results on election day. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. A few people that I have to thank here are the Provost Veit for your kind introduction, of course, Laura McDonald at the Alumni Office, and Tina Johnson in the Polling Institute office for basically putting this together and monitoring this and getting me your questions so I can see them. I also want to thank our Fred and Dave in particular and our media ops for getting this up on Zoom. And there will be I think we're going to put it up on our YouTube channel here, so there'll be a recording of it available for folks who had to miss this. And I also invite all of you, if you have any questions for me, you can find me on our contact information is on our website. Again, that's monmouth.edu/polling. You go there and you can get all the information. And I want to thank you. Thank all of you for coming out to this talk, and again, I encourage you all to, if you haven't already, get out there and vote. It's important to do. Thank you very much.